Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. If you're enjoying this podcast, please share it with your friends or your network. Our guest in this episode is Curtis Sargent. Curtis is the co-facilitator for the 2414 Coalition. He founded Zúme and is the author of the book, The Only One. Well, we have a conversation in and around movements. So when we're talking about movements, we're talking about a movement of disciples making disciples and churches planting churches that multiplies generations deep and leads to the kingdom of God coming to earth as it is in heaven. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. So here's Curtis. Curtis Sargent, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Yeah. So, what were some of the things that you learned as you served overseas that still carry with you today?
Wow, that's a broad question because most of my life was overseas. I grew up actually in Asia. So I assume you mean from when I started working among unengaged people groups? Or
yeah, sure. Let's we could talk a little bit. I think, especially with All Nations, the work that I'm doing is leading a missions agency. There's also a lot of people raising people on the fields. And so I think we could get into some of that too. I think that would be really helpful as you grew up overseas. What was that formation like for you, and what was helpful to keep you focused on Jesus throughout your life?
So I do think there are some kind of advantages that come from growing up in a culture other than your passport country. I think there's probably a greater motivation to be a keen observer of people and situations, maybe a little less, is assumed in terms of your own expression of your thoughts or whatever. So just the observational aspects, I think, are helpful, maybe a little less prone to assuming other people think or feel or act the way that you do.
Yeah.
So I think that's also helpful, in life in general. And those would be obviously harder to pick up if you lived in a mono-ethnic, just living in an area where everybody has a lot of similarities to you.
Is there a way that you found helpful now as you're living in the States and you're with some people that maybe make more assumptions about what other people believe as they maybe focus a little bit, they're a little ethnocentric just because they haven't had that experience with others? Is there a helpful way to engage people so they don't assume what others are thinking?
Anytime you can either identify or create dissatisfaction in people, and discovering it is a lot safer option than creating it.
Yeah.
Since nobody likes to burr in the saddle. Because, dissatisfaction in a lot of ways is a prerequisite for change. If somebody's not dissatisfied with the way things are, they have no motivation to change. So identifying that and then teasing it out. And of course, in any given instant, you always have the potential tool of making unexpected statements, anytime you say something that's counterintuitive to people or contradicts, unexamined assumptions, it'll get their attention and at least opens the possibility for maybe a deeper level of discussion.
Yeah.
So.
And that's good. That's always leading to a deeper level of discussion. I think is really helpful in the way that we interact with others, because if we're sitting back, if we both assume we know what the other believes, sometimes we don't do that job and that work of discovering what each other thinks and believes, and then we don't do the job of asking questions that would further a deeper conversation and a deeper conversation towards Jesus and who he is and what it actually means to live in the kingdom of God. What was your direction in your journey towards unengaged people groups?
So the summer after my freshman year in high school, I guess. And so at that time, my parents were serving in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
I was at an all-night prayer meeting with some of my friends and had a very clear call to the unengaged, although that term was not yet in use, at that time. And so from that point on, that's been the focus kind of my life is, trying to eliminate the existence of unengaged peoples.
Yeah.
And so, my assumption at that point was that I would be serving in restricted access environments, which I did for many, many years. And so, trying to do preparation in terms of education and experience that would allow me to, get a job in those environments and work and serve in those environments. And so, from the rest of high school and college and then into, serving, that was sort of the focus. So, I mean, even when I was in college, I put together, multi-state conferences on tent making in restricted access areas.
Wow.
And, things like that.
Yeah.
And then all of my professional preparation was in that direction.
Wow. And as you stepped into that and you landed in country, when you were looking for open and hungry people for Jesus, did you find that people were open and receptive, and that they were hungry for something more and different spiritually, or did you find a big resistance at the beginning?
Well, we didn't see a lot of fruit at the very beginning, but it wasn't necessarily because of spiritual hardness. I think, there were other factors like not being good in the language yet. They had their own language, not reduced to writing. So learning it was, a little bit of a process, and then some just cultural barriers more than necessarily hardness of heart. But the wonderful thing about unengaged people groups is the blank slate effect. Maybe that there's less of that among Muslim unengaged groups. But other than Muslim unengaged groups, almost any other, belief system, if they're an unengaged group, you really do have, to a very large degree, a blank slate in terms of what it means to be a follower of Christ.
Yeah.
And so, in some senses, it's the easiest kind of work there is. You get to make, you're not building on someone else's mistakes. You get to make your own mistakes.
Right.
I don't know, maybe it betrays some of my worldview, but I really think that among all unengaged groups, that there is a degree of innate openness in terms of hunger, at least.
Yeah.
It may not be specifically openness to the gospel, but in terms of openness to, knowing something's missing,
Yep.
I think that's there in almost every group. So,
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I like to mention and talk about is figuring out what is the good news for the people that you're engaging, the people that you're talking to. Jesus is good news to everyone, and he wants to speak specifically to people and in their circumstance and what they're going through and what is good news. So what are some of the cultural issues that you were grappling with and dealing with as you were walking into that situation, and how did you engage those cultural issues?
yeah, I guess the people group that we were targeting, essentially their worldview was animistic.
Mm-hmm.
So, there aren't big worldview issues to overcome in
Yeah.
working with animistic peoples. And the I don't know, biggest advantage culturally was this people group was definitely the dominant people group. I served on a large island
Yeah.
for the first 5 years, and they were definitely the dominant people group on the island, and they were just known for extreme laziness, being ill-tempered, being unreliable, having a tendency to violent outbursts, to be all of these things.
Yeah.
And so if you're in that situation, a life changed by Christ is shocking.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, the contrast is so extreme that, there's no debating it. There's no arguing with it. It's just what happened to that person.
Yeah.
So once you start getting some fruit, there's no difficulty, quote, selling the product,
Yeah.
because it's like, do you want this life or do you want this life? Everybody
Yeah.
would love to be and have around them people who are loving,
Yeah.
concerned, patient,
Wow.
expressing all the fruit of the spirit. And so the contrast is so sharp.
Mm.
And then in our case, we also had another advantage, was that the cultural environment had been very stable for a number of centuries.
Yeah.
And then was suddenly going through a dramatic change just as we arrived. And so that creates opportunities as well, because, as you know, when people are undergoing a significant, transition, they're more open to other transitions,
Yep.
including, consideration of following Christ. So
Yeah.
that was an additional advantage in our situation.
Yeah. And that's a huge advantage. I mean, when my wife and I were in the Middle East and we were working with Syrian refugees coming out of a war zone and coming out of that situation, we saw Arab Muslims open for the first time, and they were ready and open to say, hey, I want to change. I want to do something. And Jesus was really the answer and the hope that they were looking for. I remember early on while we were working with Syrian refugees, and we saw a number of them start to say yes to Jesus. They were having dreams. There's all sorts of things that were happening. We were sitting with some workers that were in the Middle East that have been in country 20 years, and they looked at each other and they said, this is what we've been praying for 20 years. It's starting to happen now. And I think one of the things that we often don't think about, we think, hey, we want to look at the fruit. We want to look at people coming to Christ. We want to look at the things that are exciting and happening. But there's been so many people that have been laying the groundwork of prayer and yearning for something to happen and asking God to move in that space and breaking up hard ground. What's the importance of prayer and movements and moves of God around the world?
Yeah, that's one of those things that, it's impossible to prove causality,
Yeah.
but the correlation is dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say currently I'm connected with a coalition called 2414. I'm one of the co-facilitators of that. And so we're tracking and working with about 1,400 what we call level 5 movements and above. So these are ones that are, hundreds of churches
as
an entry point. And I'm not aware, at least, of any of those that started apart from serious prayer.
Yeah.
And there's, at least two aspects of that. One is prayer from those outside the group where the movement starts.
Mm-hmm.
But then also a huge factor is the prayer of the new believers as they come to faith within the group.
Yeah.
Just how strong that the culture of serious prayer is. And, I mentioned that through elementary school, I grew up in South Korea. And of course, the South Koreans are, well known for their commitment to prayer. So every morning I would be wakened by the church bells ringing at 4 a.m. and I could look out my window and watch all the people walking to the churches for prayer.
Wow.
And,
you actually had to do 4 a.m. I lived in South Korea for 2 years, and we had 5 a.m. prayer. So, man, they're not as prayer warriors anymore.
From the 60s to whenever you were there, they got stopped. Yeah. So, I guess the 60s, they were harder core.
They were harder core.
We very much include not only our speaking to God, but our listening to God. And that's not actually true in the global church, I don't think.
Yeah.
In some ways, it permeates every disciple's life because of the constant focus or intentionality or attentiveness, and so in some ways you could say that prayer was the defining characteristic of a movement life.
Wow. Yeah, and I think that hearing from God and listening to God, obeying Him, is so key and so important. And that's one of the things that I've found that I think in America we're starting to catch up with, but we're a little bit behind in that. And as you moved to the States, what were some of the things that you were finding that were a little different from the new believers in unengaged people groups, the people living out their faith, and then just life in American Christendom?
Yeah, some of those things that you asked about, at the very beginning of this of our discussion, where there's just not an awareness that there are other possibilities, that there are other patterns, that there are other options, that there are other expressions of living out our faith. I don't know what percentage of people who claim to be believers in the States would fall into this category, but I think many are absolutely serious about their faith, but they are not aware of all that the Lord intends for them or desires for them or desires from them. They're doing what they've been asked. They're doing the best they know.
Yeah.
And, it's hard to fault them. And that goes for
Yep.
Christian leaders as well.
Yep.
They're doing all that they know. They want to do the best they can,
Yeah.
etc. But they're not aware, that there is more. And so, part of the problem or the challenge is how to help them come to that awareness without alienating them.
Yeah.
Because, it can feel demeaning or, I don't know, just, negative in some way to imply that they could be doing differently, or, they could be seeing more fruit, or they could be seeing better quality fruit, or et cetera, how to communicate that without alienating people. Because it's like what I mentioned earlier about it's safer to find dissatisfaction than to create dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
And this is a great example of that. So if you find people who just think there must be more,
Yep.
I want more, those people, it's quite easy to get them, living a different sort of kingdom life. But if it's people who aren't feeling that, they may not respond well, at the suggestion that there could be more.
Yeah.
So another big thing is, and this isn't entirely like a North American centric thing, but the US is toward one end of a spectrum. But places that have high urbanization also tend to go this direction, is their use of time, or their conception time, and how to steward time and how to prioritize time. And it's probably exacerbated by the North American tendency to separate the secular and the sacred. Right. So we tend to divide, life into these different categories rather than having a more holistic, type of conception of the various parts of our lives. But between those two things, it's a common reaction for North Americans who learn about kind of a movement approach to say, I don't have time to do that.
Yeah.
So they're viewing, there's X number of hours for this, X number of hours for that, as opposed to how do I live as a kingdom citizen in every aspect of my life, 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
And so then, they just see that differently. And that's often a challenge to people because it is a 24/7 commitment.
Yeah, it is.
And so that, I think that's a significant challenge here. Terminology, and this is true in any place, but it's definitely true here in North America.
Yeah.
That when we use words like, church or disciple, or, pick another couple of dozen words, what they're hearing and what we're intending are often significantly different. And that's just a, universal aspect of challenge of communication in any context. But because of the strong Christian heritage here in North America, those spiritual terms in particular can often pose a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah. So if you would define a disciple of Jesus, what is a disciple of Jesus, and how can we make disciples?
Yeah. So I don't have a, off the shelf definition, but it would be someone who has, given their life completely to God and is characterized by, living in obedience to him.
Yep.
So it's, pretty straightforward. As we're making disciples, I do have a list, a literal list of things that I'm trying to make sure every disciple is equipped in. So that's not a definition,
right?
But it's more of a description of how to go about making disciples.
Yeah.
So if that's helpful, I think in terms of aspects like trying to equip every disciple to be a contributor and not merely a consumer.
Yep.
And so particularly we look at 4 aspects related to that. Is I need to make sure every disciple is equipped to be a self-feeder in regard to scripture. So interpreting and applying scripture.
Yep.
And this is true even if they're non-literate. Second would be prayer. And so again, including both the listening aspects and the speaking aspects.
Yep.
And the many different ways prayer can be used. So a lot of people don't think of it that way, but there are many uses for prayer. So for example, teaching. So Jesus does this at Lazarus' tomb. He says, Father, I thank you that you hear me. I know that you always hear me, but I say this for the benefit of those who are here listening. So he's very intentionally modeling how you teach people about the character and nature of God by how you pray in their presence.
Yeah.
Now, is that something we always do? No, but that's one of many uses for prayer that people don't think of, a lot. So the third aspect would be body life. So, things like sensitizing them to the one another's in scripture, or how God designed us as a body with the spiritual gifts and all the implications of that and so on. And then finally, how to respond well to persecution and suffering.
Yeah.
So there's more in scripture about how God develops us through persecution and suffering than about how he develops us through his word or through prayer or through body life.
Wow.
There are many, many, many passages that discuss that and talk about the specific benefits that are to come from those and are very explicit in terms of God's intention for how he wants us to respond to those things.
Yeah.
We're guaranteed they will happen if we're serious in following him. And so it only makes sense that we equip people to be aware of the benefits, the intentions, and the desires on God's part on how we're to respond. Yeah. And those are massive in our growth. So that's self-feeding aspect. And then helping, when we're talking about making disciples, I like to talk in terms of giving them a pair of eyeglasses that have 2 lenses. One of the lenses would be the network of ongoing relationships that we have, friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, classmates, all of those, and how to steward those over time for the kingdom. And then the other lens being everybody else, with an emphasis on the least, the last, and the lost, and how to respond and steward opportunities there, because there are different principles and practices that are typical in those 2 worlds. They're very different, but they're both important, because one is how the gospel travels farthest, the other is how it travels fastest. One is focusing more on the long-term development and so on. And so every disciple needs to be equipped to live out their faith in both of those contexts, reaching both types of people. And so that's a key thing. And then just some of the patterns, like the one we've already discussed about obeying and passing on
Yeah.
what we receive. So that has all kinds of implications.
Yeah.
And
It's huge.
it's one of those fractals that it characterizes how I read my Bible
Mm-hmm.
every morning, how I am praying, and then corporate aspects in my spiritual family, in the larger network,
Yeah.
in our city or our state or our country, and in their
Yep.
applications individually and corporately in every aspect of life at every level in every application. And so that kind of look back, look up, look forward
Yep.
pattern occurs all over the place. And so there are certain patterns like that that I want to make sure to drill deeply, into people. And so yeah, I've got this, list of things that I want to equip
Yeah.
every disciple in. And in fact, the most challenging of all of those is the training cycle itself. The model, assist, watch, and lead,
Yep.
and all the fine points of that, because that's kind of an art more than a science. And so
Yeah.
it takes people a long time to really become expert at that. And that generational aspect is the defining characteristic of movements. So
Yeah.
that's the most challenging,
Yeah. That model assist watch
capability.
leave is it is definitely a challenging one. Um, what advice would you give? I had a couple of friends that live in Chicago, and they have been doing some discovery Bible study with their friends. They had some pre-believers, some non-believers within discovery Bible studies. Someone found Jesus. He wanted to go start it with some of his friends that don't know Jesus yet, and he's doing it with them. And their pastor realized, hey, they're doing something great. And I like what they're doing. So he said to them, okay, you're going to be in charge of our discipleship and outreach part of our church. Are there any tools or things that those people can use when they're thinking about church community that want to live out a life of discovery, discipleship, obeying what Jesus tells them, and then passing it along? Do you have any tools or anything that they can use to help facilitate that?
A couple of ones that come to mind. One would be there's an introductory kind of online training that's designed to be self-facilitated called Zúme.
Yeah.
So it's ZUME.training would be the URL. And it can provide a nice little package to introduce people.
Yep.
And there are a lot of different ways you can use it. It's kind of native context is 10 2-hour sessions. But there are, a multitude of other kind of delivery options or venues that people can use. So that would be one tool that I would suggest that's readily accessible, and it's available in most major languages.
Wow, that's great.
It's currently in 38 languages with a number of others in development. A second one would be I sort of wrote a book as a soft, indirect introduction to movement for North American believers.
Yeah.
To try to kind of create that dissatisfaction without alienating anybody. And so the book is called The Only One. And you can get the ebook version for free at theonlyoneBook.com.
Great.
And that might be a resource that would be helpful. And, I'm pretty sure, people are not going to find anything in there that's going to alarm them. For example, now Dallas Theological Seminary is requiring it for every student in the seminary.
Wow, that's amazing.
So
That's great.
it's they're known to be, pretty conservative
Yeah.
and all of that. So, hopefully people aren't going to find anything in there that they consider heretical, but it serves as a kind of a soft introduction.
That's really good. And I think that's really helpful for a lot of people. And I think that's one of the things that people have really been looking for are soft introductions to get people thinking something different, to get a little bit of a paradigm shift is really helpful to say, hey, we could actually live out our faith in a new form or a different way, but it's very authentic to Jesus, his life, his teachings, his commands, and it's not, something that's watered down. It's actually more of a kingdom life than sometimes we actually get to engage in. And I think part of that is that sacred secular divide that you're talking about, that it actually then starts to integrate all of life into the kingdom and into the sacred. I'd love to just, as you talk about movements in 2414, level 5 movements, I don't know if everybody would know what you're talking about. So can you just define that quickly of what we're talking about with movements?
So basically, when we're talking about a movement, we're talking about at least fourth generation churches and at least 4 streams within 3 years from when you start. And so you could have 100,000 churches without hitting that, if they're all first and second generation, churches or whatever, or third. So that's what we're using as the definition for movement. And so this scale, 1 on the scale essentially means you're trying to use movement approaches among a certain population. People, group, place. So that's level 1. You're just trying. Level 2 would be you're seeing some first generation fruit and maybe a little bit of second generation fruit. That would be a level 2. And then we have subdivisions, within these. Right. Level 3 would be you're seeing some consistent second generation fruit and maybe some third generation. Level 4 would be you're seeing consistent third generation reproduction and maybe some fourth generation. Level 5 would be you're seeing regular sustained fourth generation. Level 6 is that it's fully indigenous leadership. And at every level. And then level 7 is that it's consistently catalyzing other movements, in other places.
How many out of those level 5 movements that you've been tracking, about 1,400, you said? How many of those have been catalyzed by previous movements?
Yeah, we don't know exactly, but our estimate is at least 80%.
Wow. Yeah. And so, movements, catalyzing movements, it's the same thing as churches catalyzing new churches down to generation. Now they're catalyzing movements.
That's right.
That's pretty exciting, that movements are saying, hey, let's look outside of ourselves and continue to different people groups around the world. That's really cool. And we're seeing that a little bit in all nations where, our level 6 movement, say, is definitely going out. And they're in, I don't know, maybe about 8 other people groups at the moment trying to catalyze movement and working towards that in their area of East Africa. And so it's something where we're always looking up and looking out. And I think that's a principle that we should all live with is, as you said, look back, look up, look forward. We're looking to see what God is telling us and teaching us, and then looking to see where he's moving and what he wants us to do moving forward. And for you, as you're looking at movement and multiplication, generational growth, where did that come into your story, and how did you get involved with movement? And
Yeah. So back when we were working on that people group on that island, there were about 6 some million people, and among that people group, there were three churches. Two of them were 5 members and 3 members, and then the other was a little bit bigger, but was not, reaching out to anybody. And so, and back then there were no telephones, so we had no communications options other than face to face.
Yeah.
And then the transportation development was virtually nil. So basically, I'm going everywhere on foot or ox cart.
Wow.
Covering 34,000 square kilometers.
Wow.
And so when I was still in the early language learning, so I spoke Mandarin, which was the national language, but very few people there at that time spoke Mandarin on that island. So I was trying to find, from the few people who did speak Mandarin, use them as language helpers to try to learn this local language. And anyway, I was out in this village one day and looking for a child to try to talk to, because I found it way less intimidating than trying to talk to an adult at that level of language development. And so there weren't any kids. There's only this old lady. So I go up and I say, grandmother, how old are you? And she said, I'm 97 years old. And that's like here saying you're 140. It's like nobody lives that long.
Wow.
It was miraculous. And so I said, wow, that is really old. And I had pretty well shot my vocabulary by that point. So she picked it up. And anyway, to shorten the story considerably, I learned several new words trying to, have this conversation with her. But at the end of the conversation, I was looking for a way out because I needed to get somewhere and write down all the new vocabulary I had just learned, And so just in case, I always would have Chinese language tracts with me. Their language wasn't reduced to writing, but if somebody speaks Mandarin, there's a chance they can read. And so, I pull out this tract and she says, I can't read. And so I said, and your son? And she says, he can't read. She said, nobody here can read. And it just kind of hit me right there. Okay, other than her age, this lady is typical of this people group.
Yeah.
And I'm standing here face to face with her, and I'm absolutely helpless to share the gospel. And, she's going to probably die next week. How much longer can she live?
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, okay, eventually I'll learn the language. And then I can share with people like this. And then I started doing a little self-evaluation. It's like, okay, let's say every single day I led a person to faith. And I did that from now till I was old enough to retire. We're probably talking 15,000 plus, less than 20 for sure, less than 20,000 new believers among 6 million plus. And, guess what? I have never over any significant period of time, average leading one person every day to the Lord,
Yeah.
in any language.
Yeah.
Pick a language, it doesn't matter. I've
Yeah.
never done it. And I'm not likely to start, being able to maintain that level of fruitfulness. And so then I was like, oh, this is horrible. This is an absolutely impossible task.
Yep.
And then, started thinking about multiplication. And it's like, well, what if every year I led somebody to the Lord, and then every year they led somebody to the Lord, and then it's the old doubling kind of a thing. Well, the people group would be reached in 15 years. Yeah. And I could do two more people groups.
Yeah.
It's like, that's doable. And then I started thinking about churches, and realized making disciples is connected with planting churches, and that's harder than just leading somebody to the Lord. And what would that look like, and so on. Anyway, started playing these things out, and realized the only way that task was doable in my lifetime was to multiply. And we were the first people on that island since 1949 that had residence permits to live on that island.
Yeah.
And, and I had nobody to confer with because we didn't have mail service. So see people once a year at Chinese New Year, we'd travel out.
Yeah.
And so I just basically developed a lot of these patterns that I teach, like in Zúme or, in other training methods, out of desperation, because, there was no other way that I knew of to reach those people except to multiply. So let's figure out how to do it, And so that was kind of a key turning point in how I changed everything I was doing.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty amazing that you're going to be able to, you get it on the field where you're at, and you can see that, oh, there is actually a different way that we could go about doing this. And it's been pretty effective, and we're seeing, movements around the world. One of the things, before, there's a couple of questions I like to ask at the end, but I want to ask one question before that. As we're looking at unreached people groups, and we're going out as missionaries, I've heard some people talking about missionaries to the church. Are there ways or that we can be missionaries to the church? What does that look like, and is that something that is happening now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you how I think about it. I think about it, well, to use an analogy, everybody has two legs, right?
Yeah.
And in some senses, at least at some level, I think most people are going to, have one foot in each world, right? You have one foot in the, quote, Christian world, and you have one foot in those that aren't, don't claim Christ.
Yep.
And God's going to call each of us, and a lot of it's going to depend on our environment, as well. But God's going to call each of us to emphasize one of those more than the other. And I think that's normal, good. I don't think that's something to worry about. For me, God called me to put more emphasis on the foot, in the lost world. But I don't doubt at all that he calls some people to put more emphasis in the kind of churched world.
Yeah.
And so then it's figuring out how to effectively, do whichever one of those, or, God calls you to emphasize more. There is no doubt which is harder. The churched world is going to be harder.
Yeah.
But there is so much potential there if you can get a breakthrough,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Because kind of the, I don't know, quote, installed base, using kind of business terms, is so large, it seems a shame not to leverage it.
Yep.
But on the other hand, so we really do need people in both worlds. I'm grateful God called me to,
Yeah.
have the generally easier world
Yep.
to work in, because there's so much less deconstruction, in a sense. Because if people come to Christ, they realize they have to change everything.
Yeah.
Whereas if they've been, or at least they think they have been, or they actually have been serving Christ, but without having that knowledge that they have to change everything, whoa, it's way harder. Yep. So I put actually a diagram talking about that a little bit in the book. So maybe you can read a little more there.
Yeah, that's going to be helpful. Go read the only one, so you could see that. I have a friend that was working in the Horn of Africa and in a desert for 8 years, and now he's back, and he's a missions pastor and a pastor of a campus of their church, and he often says, I wish I could go back to the easy job. And that, catalyzing new movements and something new, working with people that don't yet know Jesus. He just always found that much easier. And I do too, frankly. But it's very important as we are engaging the church and community, as we're opening people up. What does it look like to live a life for the kingdom and in the kingdom, and for Jesus? It's great. So these last two questions I have. One is, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, is there any advice that you would give yourself?
Well, that's hard to imagine, because so much of what I've learned, came from making mistakes and all of that.
Yeah.
So of course you wish you could avoid that. So I'd say, read my book, go through the training. I would probably give myself some advice about not relying on or assuming the necessity of, organizations or, agencies. Because I think early on, my assumption was we have to change, those aren't necessary. So we have to, probably change the ones that are to be more effective. And which is related to your just previous question, about working in the church world versus not. And, so that I would have learned earlier, it really is easier to start from zero than to remake something in many cases. And that might have saved me, quite a lot of pain over the years.
Yeah.
Maybe
that's good.
My first response.
Yeah, that's good. Anything that you're reading or watching that you would recommend?
I do actually a lot of reading, because a lot of people send me books for input. But so I can't really mention the ones I've been reading recently because they're not published yet.
Yeah.
But maybe rather than giving specific titles, I'll just mention something that I think bears watching and thinking about. And that would be global societal trends, especially around communications and, kind of all the new expressions of community that are forming around online,
Mm-hmm.
online activity. And those are areas that definitely impact whether we're working in the church world or the non-church world. They definitely impact how people are thinking, how people are relating to one another, how people are processing information. And I think that as a global church, we're starting to get better again at responding to technological development opportunities.
Yeah.
Back when the printing press came into being, the church was, an early innovator and user of that. And then it's like over time, we got less and less astute at, at that. And now I think we're starting to have, more capacity and capability in that. But I would love to see us do even better.
Yeah.
Than we have been. And I think there are some amazing opportunities. And there are also new obstacles that we haven't probably broadly recognized yet. And we'll save ourselves a lot of trouble if we can figure out those new barriers earlier rather than later. So that might be an area I would suggest people give some thought to.
Yeah, that's really helpful and really good. You mentioned Zúme and the only one. Anywhere else that people could find your work, your training?
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily my training, but the 2414 community I mentioned. So if somebody is a practitioner or wants to be, the website for 2414 is 2414now.net, 2414now.net.
Yeah.
And that would be a way to get connected with people in your region or country that are practitioners so that you can, learn from one another and begin to collaborate to figure out where the gaps are in your context and address those. If somebody has that kind of a heart and yet is not yet convinced of movement, then maybe an intermediate step might be to get involved with finishing the task. So the new iteration of that is just kicking off and is promoting movement, but open to participation by the much broader body of Christ. So if somebody isn't yet convinced to the point where they want to become a practitioner, but still wants to be maybe moving that direction and thinking about it more, that would be a softer, more gradual way to wade into the water. So.
Yeah, excellent. Those are helpful. So, Curtis, thank you so much for joining us and being on today. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.